Okay, welcome to session 3 in our curriculum program at Skinner's. And today we're going to be talking about selection, sequencing, and spaced practice. And the end product from today's session is going to be developing curriculum maps for our subject areas. So this is a reminder of the diagram of how we plan our curriculum here. And we started off by designing a curriculum rationale and identifying the most powerful concepts that make our subject distinct from all others. And within that, you have your substantive and procedural knowledge, your knowing information, and then you're knowing how to do certain activities within subjects which we identify. And then we map those onto our curriculum maps. So what are the topics, what is the knowledge, what is the procedural and the substantive knowledge that we need in order to teach our subject effectively and to give our students the best possible chance of opening intellectual doors as they move forward in life. So we're at that middle stage now of designing those curriculum maps. As I just said, we've completed those first 2 steps. The step after this is then to do schemes of learning. That's when you're going to go into a little bit more depth about what each lesson is going to try to achieve. That's when you're really going to think very carefully about exactly what knowledge goes into what order. And then the final step, obviously, is to design lessons. Now, it's simple, but it isn't simple. Selecting the best topics is, in one sense, it's relatively simple. We know our subjects well, and we should be able to identify the main things that students need to know. There are problems with that, and there are reasons why that's difficult, as I'm going to talk through today. Easily, the harder thing to do is to sequence those topics, to work out what order they should go in order to best teach students those ideas. That's a much more difficult thing to do. So it's simple, but it isn't simple. Now, at this stage, I'd recommend you to go over to our video from Rachel, who talks about decolonizing the curriculum. And that's incredibly relevant for any subject leader who wants to discuss selection and equality within the curriculum. I'm, however, not going to repeat that during this presentation because it would be the exact same content. So please go over there and watch that video now. Otherwise, if you are with me having watched that, let's talk through selection and why it's so important. So what you are trying to work out as a subject leader then is what is the most powerful knowledge that all students need to know? What is the information that opens those intellectual doors? And then what topics within your discipline teach that powerful knowledge the best? They are the best exemplifiers of that powerful knowledge. And all you do then is if you're faced, if you're a Key Stage 3 and 4 subject, you're faced with a series of boxes. You're faced with term 1, term 2, term 3. And all you need to start doing is you need to start writing in those ideas and those topics. As I say, this isn't going to be reinventing the wheel. If you are the head of geography, then at Key Stage 3 at some point, they need to do some human geography. And so that would be one of the things you'd want to identify straight away. That is one of the best ways of teaching powerful knowledge in geography. If you are the head of RS, then you know that within Key Stage 3 at some point, they need to be looking at scripture. They need to have some scriptural skills. They need to be able to understand the way that holy books work. So again, that would go into my rough initial selection guide. Now, what debates are there? Well, what I'd like you to do as subject leaders is to challenge yourself and your department. And you should debate, should we teach this? If you have a choice, if it's not within the exam board's scheme, if it's not, Key Stage 4 and 5, if you have that decision and that choice, problematize everything you teach. You've hopefully listened to that session on decolonizing the curriculum. How does that influence whether you should teach that or not? Does it influence the way that you should teach it? Maybe not to say that you shouldn't teach it, but maybe influence the way that you teach it. Why do we teach this topic? What is the purpose? How does it relate to the powerful knowledge? Are we teaching it simply because it has always been taught? And is there another topic which could exemplify the powerful knowledge better? That's the really key thing to do, to think about. Is there something else that we don't teach that could do this better? And I'll give you an example from Key Stage 5 that might actually help here. In sociology, you have the concept of status, but it's actually not explicitly taught within the textbooks and within the curriculum materials that you get from the exam board. Status weaves its way through all of the units. The idea of power in relation to others. Now, when I was teaching this, I didn't teach it explicitly, and I would find after an entire year of the course, some students wouldn't have a clear understanding of what status is, and yet they'd be able to tell me about the relationship between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And so there was this real disconnect there that I hadn't given them the foundations. So by teaching status explicitly for a couple of lessons, I was then able to exemplify that powerful knowledge much more effectively than I had before. So once you've selected your topics, you then have to sequence them. And this is a little bit harder. What is sequencing? Well, sequencing is the simple idea that learning builds on what has come before. When we learn something, we do not learn in a vacuum. We are building. So in the last session, I talked about schema, this idea that in our long-term memory, we have this nexus concept, which then gives birth to lots of other different ideas, and it helps to hook on to this initial concept. Now, when you have a really complex schema for a concept, then what happens is that learning is faster and easier. So when we sequence our curriculum, we are about making it easier to learn. That is the entire point. Now, when we are sequencing, this links to our powerful knowledge, or this is very, very, very closely tied to powerful knowledge. When we've identified the most powerful concepts within our subject, what we're saying is that they are that nexus of the schema. They are the central concept, the central point, without which it is difficult to understand all of the other ideas. So when we sequence, we need to systematically revisit, to systematically deal with, explain, and exemplify the powerful knowledge within the curriculum. If we don't do that, we will risk students forgetting the most powerful knowledge within our topic. And that is the exact opposite of what we want. So what we want to see within a sequence curriculum is that knowledge and skills are built upon. They get more and more complex the further up you go. Now, if you have a really poorly sequenced curriculum, as I've definitely taught many poorly sequenced curricula, what will happen is that it will be very hard to tell the difference between a Year 7 lesson and a Year 9 lesson. There might be a PEE paragraph that they have to produce at the end. The higher ability students in Year 7 are probably doing better paragraphs than your lower ability students in Year 9, and everybody else is in between. The actual content that's delivered, I've seen in some schools just having Key Stage 3 RE lessons, and then you teach them in Year 7, 8 or 9, depending on what you like. Now that's an absolute nonsense, because what you're saying there is that your curriculum does not get more complex. It does not build that schema in the student's mind. What you're saying really is it's pick and mix. You go and pick out a little bit here, pick out a little bit there, and you can't expect students to get better very fast teaching like that. Okay, so The Simpsons and the Game of Thrones. I think this is Christine Counsell that came up with this analogy. You have two ways of doing the curriculum, or two initial points to make here about how a curriculum can be designed. You can design your curriculum like The Simpsons, and I just told you about that RS curriculum I did. If you watch an episode of The Simpsons, you very, very quickly latch on to what's going on, who's doing what, and what's happening. And that's because each episode is designed as a kind of standalone. There aren't very many running themes that go through The Simpsons at all. They're all just one-off episodes. So when I was teaching a bit of Hinduism to Year 8, and a bit of Hinduism to a Year 7 class, because, you could pick and mix, then that was a bit like The Simpsons. You just sort of dove into one bit, dove into another bit. Now, Game of Thrones is obviously more of a serial. So if you go into Season 5, Episode 4, you won't have a clue what's going on. And that's because you need to start at the beginning. And the characterization gets increasingly complex. Well, it does in certain cases within. Depends on the acting a bit with Game of Thrones, to be honest. But the characters should get more and more complex. The plot should get more and more complex. And it should build and build and build to an amazing crescendo. No spoilers there. Not that amazing. So how to sequence the units? Well, this is the tricky bit. This is the bit that's a little bit harder. So when you have this diagram in front of you, you need to ask yourself, Why is this topic before this topic? What is the point of that? What is the reason for this topic being before that? Are there aspects of this which are harder than that? If so, what are those aspects? And does that mean it should go before or should go after? When you've thought like that, you'll find that it starts to get increasingly difficult, particularly obviously at Key Stage 3. At Key Stage 4 and 5, it is a little bit, it's a bit more straightforward because we often teach in modules as designed by the exam board, and it doesn't make sense to play around too much with them as modules. What becomes more important at Key Stage 4 and 5 is actually your recall that you get students to do to make sure that they don't forget entire units that they've done before. So here's an example of how it could work. So this is these are 5 topic areas that I want my students to learn about. I think if they leave secondary school having not studied these 5 religions, I think we're probably doing them a disservice. There's a complex debate here around whether Sikhism should be included, and is it number of believers you go by? Is it global influence? This is the decision that I made, and I made this decision because of some of those reasons I just mentioned, and because of time constraints. So there is one way that we could sequence this. We could do it as it stands here. Now, that wouldn't work very well. It's not chronologically in order. Islam, 632 CE. Christianity, 0. Judaism, much longer before, 800 BC, etc. So Hinduism, even longer before that, and Hinduism comes before Buddhism chronologically. So this would be a little bit of a mess to sequence it like this, because you wouldn't have that chronology in students' minds. So what you could do then is you could sequence it like this. And that would be a much more logical way of doing it. But actually, when I thought about it, I thought, well, what is the thing that we really need to teach students in order for them to be able to access and understand these religions in a deeper way? And I think actually it was more about them understanding the texts, because once you understood the texts, you could then start to interpret those other religions better. So I ended up with this sequence. And that was because I'd identified within that a weakness that they weren't going to have as deep an understanding of the textual analysis, and I changed my sequence to reflect that. Now, you will make all of your own subject decisions based on this, and you will be able to do that as the subject expert. Nobody else is going to be able to do that for you. So when you have your powerful knowledge, your job then is to work out what order that powerful knowledge is going to go in and how you're going to systematically revisit it. This is a reminder of the powerful knowledge I identified for RS when I was the head of RS. Feel free to pause the video just to have a read through and to have a look at it. Now, this is an example of what our curriculum map is going to look like. So this is just one small section of it. We have up at the top half term 1 and half term 2. And down the left, we have year 7, and we have the main concepts, the main ideas, the main things that I want to teach students inside the box. It's not a week-by-week analysis. It's not what they're going to be doing every single lesson. It's when I write down those 2 topic areas, I'm thinking I definitely want them to cover these chunks of knowledge. And then what I've done underneath is I've mapped out what pieces of powerful knowledge are going to be taught within those topics. And what is amazing and what is so useful is when you come to do your schema learning, you can think, right, that's the powerful knowledge that is in this topic. When do we teach it, and how do we teach it, and how do we make sure students don't forget it? The links row is all about how that unit relates back to the previous unit. So in the second half term, the fact that they've done Bible skills and the fact that they've done Jesus as a response to the fall informs the New Testament studies that they do. This is what the curriculum map looks like a little bit larger. And so the reason why you've got sort of greyed out half terms is because we were on a rotation with citizenship. And as you can see here, well, in fact, I'd recommend you pause the video and just sort of take it in, read as much as you can. As you can see, we have mapped our powerful knowledge using colour coding throughout the Year 7 and Year 8 of RS. I have not filled in too much detail into those boxes about what's going to happen in the lessons, because that comes in our scheme of learning. Our scheme of learning is when we work out lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. I've made the obvious links clear to previous topics. There probably are more links than that, actually. I could probably extend that, but tried to make those nice and clear. And the powerful knowledge has been mapped systematically throughout these 2 years. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if we do ethics and morality in half term 1 and 2, we then don't meet it until half term 3 of year 8. So as a head of department, I have to think, what am I going to do in half term 3 and 4 to ensure they don't forget ethics and morality? That is my challenge in my scheme of learning. What am I going to do to make sure that that is not forgotten? Because if that powerful concept and the knowledge that comes from it is forgotten, then by the time we get to half term 3 of year 8 for Islam, the ethics and morality information will be gone from the student's long-term memory. And that's why it's so useful to map the powerful knowledge across the topics. It's easier to see gaps. That's the main thing you want to do. Now, every single teacher will complain about these gaps. All we're doing is we're finding clear terminology for it. We've all heard the maths teacher say, how have they got to year 9 not being able to divide? How the history teacher who says, how can you have got to year 9 and not be able to read a timeline? How have you got to this stage and you can't? You don't know that Jesus was the Son of God. All of these things that we've all regularly said. And the answer is that it's our fault. The reason why students forget stuff is because we've not taught it systematically. Now, there are some things they're going to forget. They're not going to remember every single thing that we teach them, which is why it's so important we map the powerful knowledge, because we systematically revisit the powerful knowledge in order to make sure it goes into the long-term memory. Now, I don't need students to remember for the rest of their life who Mary Magdalene was. It's not that important in the whole context of Christianity. But who Mary, the mother of Jesus, was, that's incredibly important, an incredibly important figure for over 1 billion Catholics. So my challenge is then, how do I make sure that that isn't forgotten? When we map out our powerful knowledge, it becomes much easier to see big gaps, like not teaching ethics and morality for a few terms. This then informs your spaced practice and your recall tasks. And your assessment becomes clearer as well. What am I going to assess? How am I going to make sure that I assess them on that powerful knowledge that I taught them a while ago? And how am I going to make sure they've got the revision materials that reminds them of that powerful knowledge that I taught them a while ago? So students will not encounter source of authority for a whole term. So I then need to plan in opportunities for that recall. If you're the head of geography, and you teach the human geography focusing on a city, let's say Rio de Janeiro, in half term 1 of year 7. What is it in that unit that you are going to make sure students remember by the end of year 9? It won't be everything. They're not going to remember everything. They're not robots. But there will be a few key, powerful pieces of information that they must remember. And it might be the definition of urbanization. It might be some examples of how politics and economics collide. Something like that would be incredibly powerful for their later units. Now, spaced practice, I've just mentioned in that previous slide, is a really important concept. I want you to just look at this graph, please. Pause the video and read it. So let me just explain the graph first. So when a student first, this is Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, which has been tested multiple times since. It's a very old graph, but it's stood up to scrutiny. And what it basically shows is that when you first learn something, you know it 100%. Obviously, you're able to recall it. You're able to say what it is. So if someone teaches you that Henry VIII had 6 wives, and then they say, how many wives did Henry VIII have? And you would say 6. Now, when we come back after a day, we find 80% has been forgotten. 80% of the information that has been learned has been forgotten. If we go back after 2 days, we're just on the first line here, we find that about 68% of the information has been retained. 80% has been retained. We then find 68% has been retained after 2 days. We find 60% has been retained after 3 days. That's a fast curve of forgetting. And if you think about students in school, they might not see you for 7 days after you've taught them. So if they review the next day, look at what happens to the steepness of that forgetting curve. If they review it the next day, if they're reminded of it the next day, if they're taught it the next day, then it's a slower process of forgetting. It takes 2 days to get to 80% memory retention, to forget 20% of it. If they review it again a third time, then that forgetting curve gets slower again. So what this shows us is that when we ask students to learn something, if we do not revisit it, if we do not repeatedly go back to it in a systematic way, they are going to forget it very, very fast. But the good news is if we do go back to it, they're going to remember it for longer. Now, you can't expect students to be tested on everything that they've just learned, every single lesson, to retain everything. You've forgotten lots of what you did at school. That's natural. That's what human beings do. But there are core pieces of information, core powerful concepts, which, if reviewed consistently, will open intellectual doors. So it's about working out what you need to review using spaced practice. And powerful knowledge is the way into that answer. So how do you sequence specific pieces of knowledge? Let me give you an example here. When do students first encounter prayer? If I'm looking at my curriculum, when is that concept first used? When do we first use that word? How do we use it? When is the next opportunity for them to hear that word? How do they then use that word again? In what context? There's some research here from Nuttall, I think it's Graham Nuttall, who talks about students encountering a concept in 3 different ways. That being really, really important for them then being able to learn that concept long term. So if you are then taking this individual piece of knowledge, you've got to think, well, when is it going to be encountered again? What happens in between? How do I ensure that that concept isn't lost? So prayer is a really powerful concept in RS. It links to one of our original powerful concepts of our nexus in community worship and communities coming together. And so I want students to know what prayer is. I want them to remember the definition. And so I need to make sure that in between their encounters of the term prayer, we are systematically testing it and revisiting it. How do we build on it over time? How does prayer become a more complex, how do we make that schema more complex over time? That's a difficult thing to think about in your curriculum. That's when in your scheme of learning and in your lessons you start to think, right, well, we did prayer last time like this. Let's use that same wording, that same definition, but let's add on this layer of complexity. And how do we ensure that what we've then taught them is going to be retained long term? How do we get it into the long-term memory? Well, one option for this is that you can ensure that they consistently have to learn the definition and the context. How do you do that? Recall at the start of lessons, use of knowledge organisers, things that we'll talk about. So, do you plan for this level of sequencing? Pause the video and read, please. Okay, so this is a level of sequencing. This is from this is from a school called Reach Academy Feltham, which is a primary all the way through to sixth form school. And they have, you can see here the detail with which they sequence their curriculum. Now, this isn't what you show on your curriculum map, obviously. The curriculum map is a broad overview. But this is the principle of sequencing that should underlie everything that you do within your curriculum. And if you do get to this level of detail where you start to think, okay, when are they encountering this word? How do we then make that word more complex? Then that's when you really are starting to embed a properly sequenced curriculum. So a summary, select the best topics. Think about equality in the curriculum, think about the powerful knowledge and the topics that are the best vehicle for that powerful knowledge. Sequence those topics. Knowledge and skills should build, they should get more and more complex, and powerful knowledge should be mapped across the curriculum. Now, should we use pro formas when we're doing curriculum maps, when we're doing rationales, when we're doing powerful knowledge, when we're doing schemes of learning? Well, the advantage of pro formas is that there's great consistency, which then means that QA is easier for everybody. So a lot of people jump straight to the QA, that the quality assuring that SLT will do, and it is easier for me. I'll say that straight away. It's easier for me if they're all in the same format. It's actually easier for heads of department as well. If you're the head of science, then you have potentially 3 members of staff designing curriculum maps. That means that each of those maps, if they are in a different format, will be a nightmare for the head of department to compare. Because you'll say, well, look, how does the sequencing work in this one? You'll have to have 3 individual conversations for how the sequencing should be expressed. That doesn't work for heads of department, and it definitely doesn't work for us as a school going forward. You might have a member who joins your department, but is also a member of 2 other departments, humanities at Key Stage 3, for example. For them to have to get their head around 3 different pro formas for curriculum maps is a nightmare. The visual field is what makes this hard. You can't see what you need to see unless you have a consistent pro forma. It's difficult to do so. We also would like these to be front-facing. We'd like to share them with our parents. This is what we do. This is how this is the curriculum that we design. And that would be really nice if we could do it consistently, because again, parents will have the same problems we have if we all have 20 different pro formas. So what are the negatives then of pro formas? Well, there's this initial problem of workload of transferring old documents onto a pro forma, which is a nightmare. I was a head of department for most of my career, and it's frustrating, it's boring, parts of it are totally menial and tedious, and it's the kind of thing that drives you balmy when you've just worked. You've taught 5 lessons in a day, and so there is that initial workload problem. Different subjects may want to have different formats. It might not be, for art, for example, the format that I've shared with you there might not work for art. They might need to adapt it and change it. So what are we going to say then? Well, what we're going to say is that we are going to use the pro forma that we have here, but that if you need to adapt it for your subject, then you ask me and we have a discussion about it, and we see if we can adapt it in a way that keeps the visual field consistent for everybody else, but also allows you to express what you need to for your subject. I then make a cast iron promise that I'm not going to change the pro forma on you again. That this is the pro forma for our curriculum maps. And once that's done, that piece of work is finished. And there's not going to be that repeat work of having to do this consistently. I apologise for the initial workload problem here. I know some of you have already created other pro formas for curriculum maps. I apologise for that. That's a mistake on our part, that we haven't been consistent from the beginning. Once we've got this done, it is done. I'm just going to finish here with a checklist of what you need to think of when you've done your curriculum map, or even while you're doing your curriculum map. Can I justify the topics I've chosen in terms of powerful knowledge? That's fairly straightforward. Can I show that my curriculum is at least as broad as the national curriculum? So this is really important if you are at Key Stage 3. If you're at Key Stage 3, then you have to show it's at least as broad as the national curriculum. Just remember that from the first session. You can't just reinvent the wheel and tear it up. You need to go back to the national curriculum and check that yours is roughly in line. Explain the sequence of topics and lessons. So, are they building in complexity? You should be able to answer the question, why does that come before that? And then finally, can you track that powerful knowledge through? Is it really clear that it is systematically revisited? And if it isn't revisited, what are you going to do about it in terms of recall? Okay, so what is the actual expectation then? Well, obviously, if you're watching this video long in the future, this would not be useful for you. But what subject departments will be doing will be creating a curriculum map per key stage per subject. So if you are in science, you need a year 7, 8, and 9 curriculum map. You would need a key stage 4 curriculum map, maybe one for triple science and one for double award. And then you would need one for biology, chemistry, and physics. So that would be 5 in total. 6 if you doubled up at Key Stage 4. If you were going to make a curriculum map for history, then you would need Key Stage 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so that is the end. Hopefully that was useful.